Most Americans ask some version of the same question after payday. I make decent money, so why does my bank account never seem to grow? Financial researchers have spent decades trying to answer that, and the answer they keep landing on rarely involves a single bad decision. It has to do with what happens to money after it arrives. A handful of habits so ordinary that almost nobody thinks to examine them, running quietly in the background of an otherwise responsible financial life. None of them look like a mistake while they're happening. That's exactly what makes them worth investigating. Start with the contradiction that sets the case in motion. Household income in the United States has climbed for decades. Wages have grown. Homes are better furnished. Cars are newer. Vacations happen more often than they used to. By almost every visible measure, life looks like it's improved. And yet the personal savings rate, the share of income Americans keep rather than spend, has stayed persistently low for much of the last 2 decades, well below what most families would need to survive a job loss or retire on schedule. This isn't a story confined to low earners living paycheck to paycheck out of necessity. It shows up across income brackets, including households earning well into 6 figures who still describe themselves as one bad month away from trouble. More money has been coming in. Less of it has been staying. Nothing about that shows up as a single event. There's no withdrawal large enough to raise a flag, no purchase big enough to trigger a fraud alert. Just years of decisions made by people who would have described themselves, honestly, as careful with money. The first habit is the one that explains the contradiction most directly: lifestyle creep, the tendency for spending to rise in step with income until a raise stops feeling like progress. Consider a composite example. Call him Jake. Jake was promoted 3 times in 6 years. His salary doubled. His apartment got nicer. His SUV got newer. Vacations went from occasional to annual, and dinners out stopped being an event and became a Tuesday habit. Each upgrade arrived on its own schedule, spaced out enough that no 2 of them ever seemed to belong to the same conversation. None of it looked reckless in the moment. Every purchase was a reasonable reward for real work, the kind of thing a person earning what Jake earned was supposed to be able to afford. Then one evening, checking a savings account he'd been meaning to look at for months, he found less sitting in it than when he was earning half as much. There was no single transaction to blame, no receipt he could point to and call a mistake. Just a decade of upgrades that had, one at a time, absorbed every raise before it could become anything else. The money was real. It simply never stopped moving long enough to become wealth. Lifestyle creep explains where a raise goes once it arrives, how a bigger paycheck gets quietly reabsorbed into a bigger life. It doesn't explain the money that was never part of any raise to begin with, the spending that shows up even in months when income stays perfectly flat. That's the second habit: impulse spending. Researchers studying it didn't find shopping carts full of luxury purchases. They found coffee, late-night deliveries ordered out of boredom, an item added to a cart at midnight and never taken out of its box. Each of these is a decision made without input from the version of you who has to look at the statement 3 weeks later, and none of them, alone, is worth noticing. $12 here, $30 there, an $8 coffee bought most mornings of the working year, a food delivery fee that costs more than the meal it's attached to. Traced across 12 months, though, these purchases routinely add up to thousands of dollars nobody consciously chose to spend. Ask someone to name their biggest purchase of the year and they'll answer instantly. A car repair, a couch, a trip. Ask them to name their smallest, most frequent one, and most people can't, because it was never framed as a decision to begin with. It was framed as a tap, a swipe, a few seconds of relief, repeated often enough to become invisible through sheer repetition rather than any effort to hide it. Impulse spending explains a leak, a slow, steady drip that's easy to miss because no single drop matters. It doesn't explain how a household ends up owing more than it earns in a given month, spending money that was never there to begin with. For that, the investigation turns to debt, and specifically to the kind of debt that charges more for the privilege of carrying it than almost any other loan on the market. Credit card interest is where this stops being about spending and starts being about arithmetic working against you. As of the second quarter of 2026, the average interest rate on credit card accounts actually carrying a balance from month to month sits at 22.15%, according to the Federal Reserve's G.19 Consumer Credit Report. And for many borrowers, depending on credit profile and card type, it runs well past that, into the high 20s. That's a rate no legal lender could get away with charging on almost any other kind of consumer loan. A mortgage or a car loan in that range would be considered predatory. Credit cards operate under a different set of rules, largely because the debt is unsecured and repayment is optional in the short term, which is exactly what makes it so easy to carry a balance without feeling the weight of it immediately. Picture climbing an escalator that's moving down. You keep walking, you keep making payments, but the incline keeps pulling you back faster than your steps can carry you forward. Run the numbers on an illustrative example. A $7,000 balance, not unusual for a household carrying credit card debt, paid down at $250 a month at 27% interest. That debt takes close to 4 years to clear and costs more than $4,000 in interest along the way. Bring the rate down closer to the national average, and the same balance disappears faster for meaningfully less. Proof that the debt itself was never really the problem. The interest compounding on top of it was. Even the number printed at the bottom of the statement works against the borrower. Research on minimum payment disclosures, first documented by psychologist Neil Stewart and replicated in later studies, found that cardholders shown a minimum payment figure tend to anchor toward it, paying closer to that number than they would if no figure were suggested at all, even when they could afford to pay more. The card issuer isn't hiding anything. The number is right there in plain print, on a statement most people scan for a few seconds before setting it aside and moving on to the next bill in the stack. The interest on that debt is money moving in the wrong direction, every month, without fail, for as long as the balance survives. The next habit is about money that never moved at all. Dollars that sat still instead of growing, which sounds like the opposite problem, but produces a similar result. Not investing sits at the opposite end of the same math. Cash sitting idle for long stretches tends to lose purchasing power to inflation, and money that's never invested also misses out on the growth compounding could have produced. Over long historical periods, the U.S. stock market, measured by broad indexes like the S&P 500, has returned an average of roughly 10% a year before inflation, which makes consistent long-term investing one of the more reliable wealth-building tools available to an ordinary household. It doesn't require picking winning stocks or timing anything correctly. Broad market index funds exist precisely so that an ordinary saver can capture that average return without needing to outsmart the market. Timing still matters more than most people assume. Someone who starts investing modestly in their 20s and someone who starts the same amount a decade later don't end up a decade apart by retirement. They end up considerably further apart than that, because early growth compounds on top of itself for years the late starter never gets back. Some of the hesitation to begin at all traces back to 2008, when stock indexes fell by more than half from their peak, and a generation watched retirement balances shrink along with them. It was a rational thing to fear at the time. It was also, over a long enough horizon, an expensive lesson to overlearn. Households that stayed invested through that period, and the recovery that followed generally, came out ahead of those who sold near the bottom. The rest of the hesitation isn't fear so much as friction, choosing an account, picking a fund, understanding fees. None of it is hard in isolation, but stacked together, it becomes exactly the kind of task that slides from this month to next year to never, because nothing visibly bad happens in the meantime. Debt and idle savings both explain money in retrospect, a balance someone can eventually look at and understand, even if the understanding arrives years later than it should have. Between them, they cover the two most visible ways money fails to grow: paying too much to borrow it and never putting it to work in the first place. But visible isn't the same as noticed. Most people carrying a credit card balance can name the balance. Far fewer can name the rate or do the arithmetic on what that rate costs them by the time it's paid off. The next habit explains why so many people go years without looking at either number at all. Subscription creep is that habit, and it may be the most deliberately invisible one on this list. According to CNET's 2026 subscription survey, the average American now spends around $111 a month on subscriptions, more than $1,300 a year. A sharp increase from the year before as streaming platforms and membership services multiply and quietly raise their prices. The same survey found that roughly $252 a year of that spending, on average, goes towards subscriptions people had simply forgotten they still had. Picture the accumulation. A streaming renewal nobody watches anymore, a gym membership sitting unused since January, a meditation app trial that converted to a paid plan 3 months ago, a cloud storage upgrade made once for a work project and never downgraded. None of these were signed up for on purpose. Exactly. They arrived bundled into a phone plan, tacked onto a checkout page, offered as a free month that quietly became a paid one. Individually, these rarely exceed $15 or $20, small enough that canceling any single one feels barely worth the effort. That's the design working as intended. Behavioral economists have a term for the discomfort a purchase is supposed to trigger before it happens. The pain of paying. And an automatic renewal that fires at 3 in the morning, on a card nobody's actively watching, is built to produce almost none of it. Subscriptions exploit a gap in attention. Money leaving before anyone thinks to look. The next habit exploits a gap in timing instead, one that has nothing to do with forgetting and everything to do with how a fresh paycheck feels the moment it lands. Payday thinking is the tendency to treat a paycheck landing in an account as a kind of reset, as though that money is disconnected from bills already owed or goals already set, free to be spent on the relief of simply having it. Picture the notification lighting up a phone, direct deposit received. For a moment, before the mortgage, the car payment, and the credit card minimum have quietly taken their share, that number feels like pure possibility rather than money already spoken for. It's why so many people feel flush on the 15th and the 30th and strained everywhere in between. The deposit doesn't register as a line on a spreadsheet. It registers as permission, and it overrides whatever careful budget was set a few calm days earlier when the same person sat down and promised themselves this month would be different. By the time the credit card statement arrives 3 weeks later, that same deposit has effectively been spent twice. Once on the obligations it was always meant to cover, and once more on the small rewards that felt earned the moment the number first appeared. Payday thinking distorts when money feels spendable, turning a scheduled deposit into something that feels closer to a windfall. The seventh and final habit works differently. It distorts how much ever feels like enough in the first place, regardless of when the money arrived. Comparison is the habit investigators nearly missed, because it doesn't register as a financial decision at all. Economists have described some version of this for decades. Financial well-being depends less on actual income than on how that income measures up against the people nearby, a dynamic sometimes called the relative income effect. Someone earning $90,000 a year can feel behind simply from a few minutes of scrolling. A coworker's newer car, a friend's bigger vacation, a neighbor's finished kitchen, all arriving in the same feed within minutes of each other. What used to be a comparison limited to the neighbors on a street is now a comparison against a curated highlight reel from everyone a person has ever met. That feeling rarely stays abstract for long. It tends to resolve into a browser tab open 20 minutes later, spending aimed at closing a gap that was never really about money in the first place. It was about status, and about not wanting to be the one who looks like he's falling behind. Nobody scrolling that feed sees the debt behind the vacation photo or the second job funding the renovation. They see the highlight and reach for their own wallet to catch up to a picture that was never the whole story to begin with. A picture edited, whether deliberately or not, to leave out everything that would have made the comparison feel less urgent. Laid out this way, the 7 habits stop looking like a list and start looking like a single system, each stage catching whatever the last one missed. A raise gets absorbed before it can accumulate. What's left gets nibbled by purchases too small to notice. What survives that gets handed over in interest on debt that never needed to exist. What doesn't go to debt sits idle instead of compounding. What isn't sitting idle leaks out through subscriptions nobody remembers agreeing to. What's left after that gets spent the moment it arrives, because a fresh deposit feels like permission rather than a balance already owed. And whatever might have survived, even that gets spent chasing a version of somebody else's life that was never as solid as it looked on a screen. 2 people can earn the exact same salary for 20 years and end up in entirely different financial positions, not because one of them found a secret the other missed, but because one person's income simply passed through fewer of these 7 filters on its way to actually becoming savings. None of the habits requires a bad person, or even an especially careless one. They require only an income and the everyday distractions of a full life, which describes most people most of the time. High earners included. A 6-figure salary runs through the same 7 filters as a modest one. It just takes longer to notice the leak, because there's more water to begin with. The question this investigation set out to answer was never really about income. Jake's salary doubled and his balance still went nowhere, and the 7 habits above are the reason. Wealth isn't decided by what a person earns. It's decided by what happens to that money in the days and months after it lands. Whether it's absorbed by a slightly nicer life, drained by purchases too small to remember, handed to a lender, left to sit instead of grow, or spent chasing someone else's highlight reel. Two households can bring home identical paychecks for a decade and arrive at entirely different futures, and the difference will rarely trace back to a single choice either of them could point to and regret. It will trace back to which of these 7 filters caught the money first and how many times. Nobody wakes up and decides to stay financially fragile. They just make the same small, reasonable choice enough times that it stops being a choice at all, until one evening, like Jake, they check a number they'd been meaning to look at for months and find that all those years of decent paychecks went somewhere they never intended. The account never lied about it. It just never got asked.